Hi, everybody. My name is Liza Akopian. I'm the president of the Armenian Student Association here on campus. And I'm here to introduce Professor Levon Marashlian, who will be speaking today. He's been teaching here since 1980, which makes it 35 years this year. And he teaches history, political science, and ethnic studies. And let's all give it up for Professor Marashlian.
Thank you, Lisa. And Lisa's been doing a great job as president of ASA, all the executives doing extra work this year because of the 100th anniversary. I want to recognize two people in the audience here, Armenian Genocide, who's a member of the Board of Trustees of Glendale College, and also Ms. Devine, and new member of the Glendale City Council. Congratulations. First, let me preface this presentation with the statement that which I always make, that the Armenian Genocide was ordered by the Ottoman Turkish government. The government is the guilty party, the responsible party. Large numbers of the population, Turkish Kurdish population, participated in it, but it's the government that ordered it, and the government is the responsible party primarily. We'll see later examples of righteous Turks and Kurds and others who rescued Armenians. And some Armenians survived precisely because righteous Turks, Kurds, Arabs saved them, who opposed the government's policy of destruction. Let me give you a very quick background. In 1915, there were 2 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. They had been living on that territory, which is today Eastern Turkey, since the second millennium BC. So they were indigenous, native to that territory. And Turks moved into that area, invaded that area, not until the 11th century AD. So Armenians had lived there for over 2,000 years before the new rulers of the land came in. What I'm going to do here today is not speak too much. What I've prepared for you will do most of the speaking, and occasionally I'm going to make commentary. I'm going to use excerpts of several films. The first one will be Andrew Goldberg's The Armenian Genocide. It's an excellent production, and it's 1 hour long, but we're only going to see excerpts, segments, but I encourage you to get it. It's available online. It's an excellent film that you can show and show your friends and so forth. Here, I'll be showing just certain parts of it.
Emergency executive legislation. These emergency acts gave legitimation from the government to arrest and deport the Armenian people in village after village, city after city, town after town.
The deportations were organized by orders from the central government in Constantinople to local governors and officials who oversaw the regional police forces. Throughout the empire, notices were put up that Armenians had to leave, or a town crier would notify the men to gather and tell the others. The local police would guard the streets and organize the march out of town.
Before the deportations, the first step of the genocide was to disarm the soldiers in the Ottoman army, the Armenian soldiers, disarmed, used as slave labor in labor battalions, and virtually all of them were eventually massacred. The next step was on April 24, 1915, was when hundreds of prominent leaders of the Armenian community were arrested suddenly, without notice, and all of them deported to other places, and all of them, except for a few exceptions, were murdered, and many in very horrible ways. So now the leadership of the Armenian community is gone. The next step was to deport who was left.
The Armenians were told they were being taken away from their homes and relocated to unspecified villages in the interior of the country.
The only way for these people to go is on foot, a journey of 60 days or more. In the heat and dust, it is still impossible for women and children and old men to start on such a journey. Even a strong man without the necessary outfit and food would be likely to perish on such a trip.
In most cases, Armenians were deported on foot, but some others were deported via the Anatolian Railway or the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. Armenians were deported from all over the Ottoman Empire, but deportation was not the intended result.
That was officially called exile or deportation, but in reality this was death march, because purposely the people were driven under escort, long marches in order to exhaust them. They were driven not the nearest roads possible, but they were driven over mountains and sometimes in circles in order to make them weary. They were not allowed to rest, they were not allowed to drink when they were thirsty. And in that way, of course, the weakest in such a convoy would die first, the weakest being the old people, the youngest, the babies, the children, and also the pregnant women or women giving birth during the deportation.
Days wore on. We marched through mountain roads and valleys. Those who could not keep up were put out of their misery. Bodies were found strewn by the wayside. The caravan was getting smaller each day. At one place, my little grandmother, like Jeremiah incarnate, madly cursed the Turkish government for their inhumanity. Pointing to us children, she asked, "What is the fault of children to be subjected to such suffering?" First my uncle, and now my grandmother, were left unmourned and unburied by the wayside. We moved on.
No human being can imagine such ghastliness. The large area was filled with the sick, but these poor ones no longer looked human. Not even animals could be found in such a condition. People would have had mercy on them and killed them, but these were the hated Christians, now in the hands of their enemies, who intended to make it as difficult as possible for them. Half-naked women lay around, and one could not tell if they were alive or dead. 2 little girls, 9 or 10 years old, were dragging away the corpse of a 6-year-old boy. It was impossible to talk to these people about God while they cried, pulled and tore at us, and the soldiers shouted at them and struck them with their sticks. To think that human beings have been the tools that have wrought such terrible misery, and it is the government that promised us time after time that nothing evil would befall our friends. Central to the process of massacre and deportation was a certain group within the Committee of Union and Progress, known as the Special Organization, led by a physician named Bahauddin Shakir.
He's a fanatical CUP member committed to the extermination of the Armenians with a plan to create mobile killing units that would do the dirty work of exterminating the Armenian people of the Ottoman Empire.
It was a secret, extra-legal, clandestine military wing of assassins, triggermen, military men, etc., who swore a special oath to be absolutely loyal to the top leadership of the legal party. They started organizing death squads out of former Caucasian tribes as well as the lumpen proletariat, the scum of the earth, convicts, people deliberately released from prison for this kind of purpose, and they started hitting and massacring Armenian convoys of Armenian deportees, either on the move or when they were encamped in certain places or inside certain towns.
It's important to point out this is Halil Berktay, and he's one of the several Turkish historians who, over the last 15, 20 years, have openly talked about this as a genocide. Taner Akçam is another one. Müge Göçek is another one. And it's an important fact to keep in mind, the evidence that he's giving. because the issue of intent is going to come out. And what did he point out? Criminals were released from prison. Murderers, rapists, robbers were convicted, were released from prison to deport the Armenians. What is the intent of the government if those kinds of people, what did he call scum of the earth, are used by the government to deport the Armenians? Ask yourself, what is the intent of the government?
Many citizens in Turkey, of both Kurdish and Turkish ethnicity, remember vividly what their parents and grandparents told them about what happened to the Armenians.
So some mullahs ordered the massacre of Armenians, but not all agreed with this. Here's one example. In 1917, the Sharif of Mecca, he issued a fatwa, and he said in there that he ordered Muslims to protect Armenians, and he said, provide them everything they might need, because they are the protected people of the Muslims, about whom the Prophet Muhammad said, quote, whoever takes from them even a rope, I will be his adversary on the day of judgment. We have to distinguish individual actions from the general population.
Babamız dedim şahsen yaptığı bir şey vardı. Ermeniler yakamışlar. Bir ağıra koymuşlar, yakmışlar. Kulağın diyor, sesi kulağına gitmedi diyor.
هیچ انسان دینسیز هم ببیشن که خود ناس نکرد را و نبوتن ارمنیلان قتلی واجب قتل الله حلال کردن انسان گو که زمشن همه ارمنیان بکشه در یه جهنم دیدد که در جنت اول انسان نظامی آخوش جلالتی آخود هر کسی شما خدا قلعان انسان آنی یک پسر سربت آوان دانی یک کسی وانی بشوش وافری کرد.
Occasionally, the Armenians did fight back. In the city of Van in 1915, they killed Turkish soldiers and held off Turkish forces for more than a month. There were similar uprisings in 3 other villages, but 1915 was not the first time Armenians had chosen to fight. In the years before World War I, Armenians responded to what they considered to be excessive taxes and oppression, with violence against Turks and Kurds, and engaged in 3 uprisings. In one case, in 1896, they even took over an Ottoman bank by force. As 1950...
Now keep in mind, some Armenians were revolutionaries, just like there were American revolutionaries in 1776, who did tarring and feathering British officials to oppose taxation and so forth. So there was that kind of activity by small numbers of Armenians. One of the justifications for the Turkish government to deny this a genocide is the accusation that there was some kind of rebellion. That's not true. Here's an example of evidence that disproves what the Turkish government says. Wolfgang Gust is a German researcher. He went through the German archives, and this is what he said. He looked through thousands of pages from 1,000 documents, and he said this: I have found nothing that refers to Armenians as a danger or as preparing a rebellion. From 1,000 documents stretching to the end of 1916, there is not one such reference. Neither is the German government, which is the ally of the Turkish government. You would think if there was an Armenian rebellion, the German government would find it convenient to point out that what our ally Turkey is doing is justified because there's rebellion. What did he say? I found nothing. He emphasized nothing in the German sources that there was any Armenian rebellion.
Time went on. The deportations and massacres of the Armenians continued.
In Trabzon, they decided to take men, women, and children out in boats and just dump them in the Black Sea, where they drowned.
از کارم دیاب باشم. از وشانشون دوستان یعنی از هر حدا دوستان یا 5 sınıfı ya 4 sınıfı çıkıyor yani. باش نسم كلمة هبو حج سليمان جبرتون مجبور شو هو كذا تعب كيف جوان شكتبه تقول ما نزام هم بيشكيشي بدو دولة فرمان الله هاي قلتي كي وانا قتلان حلال او دیدار مجی من نبوده که وانا جی انسان چی نکرد روی هوی مجی ذکر.
During the period of the genocide in 1915, there was tremendous response from the U.S. Writers, religious, and political leaders such as H.L. Mencken, Ezra Pound, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Rabbi Stephen Wise, and William Jennings Bryan all spoke out for the Armenian cause. Former President Roosevelt described the events as the greatest crime of the war. In addition, a charity called the Near East Relief Foundation sent over $100 million in aid to the starving Armenians, as they were known. $1.3 billion in today's currency.
$1.3 billion. American generous support to rescue refugees, survivors. And this was the first ever on the globe, first ever humanitarian relief effort. We're become used to it now. There are numerous cases that happened. Latest one maybe was Haiti, for example. But the Armenian example was the first time the international community joined to save huge numbers of refugees. It had never happened before. And unfortunately, it's happened. We've needed that kind of relief too often in the future, unfortunately.
So thoroughly were the Armenian massacres covered in the press.
By the way, the nearest relief is going to be part of a presentation we'll have on April 23, right in this hall, and to focus on in more detail what nearest relief did, American nearest relief. And that's a chapter in history that Americans and America should be very proud of, and you'll get more information about that on April 23.
That in 1915 alone, the New York Times ran 145 articles, and the reporting was clear. This was government-planned, systematic race extermination. Several U.S. consuls and their staffs were stationed throughout the Ottoman Empire. The U.S. Ambassador Henry Morgenthau was in Constantinople. U.S. Consul Jesse Benjamin Jackson was in Aleppo. U.S. Consul Oscar Heiser was in Trabzon. And U.S. Consul Leslie A. Davis was stationed in Harput.
We saw hundreds of bodies and many bones in the water below. It was rumored that many of the people who were brought here had been pushed over the cliffs by the gendarmes. That rumor was fully confirmed by what we saw. In some of the valleys there were only a few bodies, but in others there were more than 1,000. I do not believe there has ever been a massacre in the history of the world so general and thorough as that which is now being perpetrated in this region, or that a more fiendish, diabolical scheme has ever been conceived by the mind of man.
It is extremely rare to find a family intact that has come any considerable distance, invariably having lost members from disease and fatigue, young girls and boys carried off by hostile tribesmen, and about all the men having been separated from the families and suffered fates that had best be left unmentioned, many being done away with in such atrocious manners before the eyes of their relatives and friends. So severe has been the treatment that careful estimates place the number of those surviving, even this far, at being less than 150,000. There seem to have been about 1 million persons lost up to this date.
For those Armenians who survived the forced marches, the end of the line was a region far to the south, in what today is Syria, called Deir Zor.
Some people made it to Deir Zor where they...
This region is in the news lately, northern Syria, where in the same area where Armenians eventually ended up, there are now massacres taking place, attacks taking place, even specific attacks against Armenians in a village called Kesab, which is composed of Armenians who were survivors of the genocide. So the irony is genocidal actions are being taken place in the same place that the Armenian genocide took place 100 years ago.
They simply died of famine and starvation.
All that I have seen and heard surpasses
And the perpetrators I'm talking about is ISIS, of course.
all imagination. Speaking of 1001 horrors is very little in this case. I thought I was passing through a part of hell. Everywhere is the same governmental barbarianism, which aims at the systematic annihilation through starvation of the survivors of the Armenian nation in Turkey. Everywhere is the same bestial inhumanity on the part of these executioners and the same tortures undergone by these victims all along the Euphrates to Dezor. Women who had not seen me arriving were searching in the dung of horses' barley seeds not yet digested to feed on. I gave them some bread. They threw themselves on it like dogs dying of hunger.
These men and other American diplomats filed reports on the atrocities they witnessed, which today are housed in the U.S. National Archives. They constitute nearly 4,000 pages of testimony and witness to the Armenian Genocide. The International Association of Genocide Scholars affirms that over 1 million Armenians died during the Armenian Genocide. Other scholars put the numbers as high as 1.5 million. The Turkish government today denies that a genocide took place and has denied this historical fact for nearly a century. In 1919, shortly after World War I ended, the British pushed the Turks to hold war crimes tribunals for the Armenian massacres. A series of trials were then held in Constantinople.
Post-war-Turkish court martials are a very significant event in criminal justice, in Turkish history, and in terms of future settlement of the issue of the Armenian Genocide. Because the Turkish military tribunal scrupulously investigated the issue of the Armenian Genocide, it concluded in its final verdict that the Young Turk Party was responsible for the conception, organization, and execution of the Armenian Genocide.
The authors of the above-mentioned crimes, the fugitives, Prime Minister Talat Pasha and Minister of War Enver, now expelled from his military career, Cemal, the Minister of the Navy, likewise expelled from the service, their guilt has been determined by a unanimous vote. In accordance, therefore, with the law code, Talat, Enver, and Cemal are sentenced to death.
Talat, by the way, was Minister of Interior, and he's the main architect. He's something like the Eichmann of the Armenian Genocide. And the government, the Ottoman government that held these trials in 1919 was the government that succeeded the Young Turk government that ordered the genocide. So the next Turkish government, Ottoman government, was liberal and disagreed with what happened to the Armenians. They began a process of restoring as much as possible what Armenians lost. They tried to make amends. But beginning in 1919 and 1920, a third Turkish government began to emerge under the leadership of a man named Mustafa Kemal Pasha. And what he did is he resisted. He went into a civil war against his own government. His government, in fact, ordered his arrest and, in fact, ordered his capture to be tried for rebelling against the government. Eventually, this new movement, the Turkish national movement, eventually succeeded in overturning the second Ottoman Turkish government. And that government, led by Mustafa Kemal Pasha, eventually established the Republic of Turkey in October 1923. And many people in his government used to be in the old Young Turk government. This segment here is from J. Maka Hagopian's Voices from the Lake. A short segment, but an important one.
Some Turks, like Vahaj Effendi, were friendly. Others saved Armenian lives, like the director of Harvard's Red Cross, called the Red Crescent in Turkey.
The mudir of the Red Crescent called here today. He is one Turk who feels dreadful about these things. He has 600 in his hospital of these poor exiles. They will not give him workers to care for them. He is truly doing his best.
So he is a Turk also, and the Red Crescent is equivalent of the Red Cross, and he saved several hundred Armenians at the risk of his own life, because he's going against the wishes of the government. Back to Andrew Goldberg's The Armenian Genocide.
Zamanın şartları içerisinde yapılması gereken yapılmış. Ama bu soykırım değil.
Neither the Turkish embassy to the United States nor the Turkish...
Now, what happened after that period of 1919, 20, 22, 23? A treaty was written in 1920 called the Treaty of Sèvres, which offered Armenians a large degree of justice. But because of the success of the Turkish nationalist movement, that treaty became a dead letter. A new treaty is written in 1923 in Lausanne, ironically, where another treaty is being written today, apparently it's finished now. Not a treaty, but an agreement. The Treaty of Lausanne, 1923. In that treaty, there's no mention of Armenians. No Armenia, no Armenian. The word doesn't exist. What happened? Between that period when all these prominent people spoke about what's happening to the Armenians, those trials were held inside Turkey. What happened since then? What happened is, because there was a new country called the Soviet Union, Turkey was seen in the US, in Britain, in France, as an anti-communist bulwark, a wall against expansion of Soviet communist influence. That's one factor. Another factor was that Turkey needed a lot of development, and that development required capital investment, which means a lot of people could make profit. So what happened is British, French, American, and other companies, basically they fell over each other, falling over each other to get contracts, competing with one another. Turkey was seen as a lucrative financial market. So powerful economic interests, influential businesses put pressure on the American government, British government, French government, and that combined with the fact that in December 1920, Mustafa Kemal invaded the small independent Armenia that used to exist, 1918 to 1920. The new Turkish force, the Turkish national movement, invaded Armenia with guns and gold provided by communist Russia, and forced that little Armenia, that used to be called America's little ally, forced that Armenia into the Soviet Union. Now, when Armenia is forced to become a Soviet republic, now it's difficult for Western countries to continue to try to give Armenia a certain degree of territory, because now any territory that they were going to give to Armenia now is going to be given to Russia, actually. So because of all these reasons, the Armenian question, the Armenian genocide became the forgotten genocide. The Armenian question became forgotten after 1923.
The embassy to the European Union would provide someone to interview for this film. But they did release a letter which stated in part,
the measures taken by the Ottoman government during World War I concerning a segment of its Armenian population cannot be acknowledged as genocide, as described in the UN Convention on the Elimination and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide.
The United Nations Convention describes genocide as any act committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group.
The crucial question is why the Armenians, not content with the word tragedy or catastrophe or disaster.
This is Gündüz Aktan. He used to be a Turkish ambassador, and here he is testifying in Congress, telling us why it's not a genocide. He's focusing on the word intent.
Insist on genocide. What determines genocide is not necessarily the number of casualties or the cruelty of the persecution, but the intent to destroy a group. Turks have never harbored any anti-Armenianism. The victims of genocide must be totally innocent.
Well, I suppose it would be legitimate to arrest Armenian revolutionaries, whatever, that's legitimate. But what guilt does a 1-year-old baby have? What guilt does a 20-year-old pregnant woman have? Why go after the women and children and old men? Were they all guilty? Obviously not. So his argument is unacceptable, rather ridiculous, but that is the position that he and his government advance. Well, he says it doesn't qualify as genocide. Let's ask the man who invented the word.
The word genocide was coined in 1943 by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew who lost over 40 members of his family in the Holocaust.
The United Nations, Dr. Lemkin is the man who created the word genocide. Dr. Lemkin, could you give us a little background on how you came to be interested in this genocide?
I became interested in genocide because it happened so many times. It happened to the Armenians, and after the Armenians, Hitler took action.
Lemkin became the leading force behind the drafting and adoption of the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted unanimously by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on December 9, 1948.
I would urge, and I think that's the spirit, the unanimous view of the Assembly, that this convention be signed by all states, ratified by all parliaments at the earliest date, in order that basic human rights be given the protection of international law for the sake of progress, social and international peace.
Despite Lemkin's efforts and those of countless scholars, activists, politicians, and even other governments, the Turkish state continues to maintain its position of denial regarding the genocide. In recent years, however, an increasing number of Turkish intellectuals have broken with the state line and spoken out on the genocide. It has often been at their own risk.
I was speaking out of a feeling of utter disgust at all the hypocrisy surrounding this question. That is to say, this nauseating repetition of all these state line phrases about the Armenian slanders, the so-called genocide, the false Armenian allegations, and so on and so forth. It was fairly clear that somehow the state, the deep state, was signaling the press that this was how they should be talking. And the media, the press, the journalists, the TV anchormen, etc., were all instinctively falling into line.
Imagine for a moment the history books of the Western world being printed without having the story of World War I in there. Here is a significant country in our world spending an enormous amount of its money, of its resources on one subject. Don't you mention the Armenian Genocide. And that's what their ambassadors and their designated representatives, including in academia, are busy doing all around the world. And the story gets dirtier. I can tell you, anybody can tell you of conference after conference, book after book, efforts to produce a TV program, a movie about the Armenian Genocide, where the Turkish government has intervened at every conceivable level.
One of the most famous examples occurred when movie giant MGM announced it was making a movie on the Armenian Genocide in 1935 called The 40 Days of Musadag. But as soon as the news reached Turkey, the U.S. State Department was contacted and pressured by Turkey into all but forcing MGM to shut the production down, which it did.
When I wrote my book and included the Armenian Genocide, I actually expected...
And the State Department helped. The Turkish embassy contacted the State Department, and the State Department helped MGM, encouraged MGM to stop this. And the primary motivation at the time was commercial.
In city after American city, to have to defend the inclusion of that case, because I understood how much controversy there was about use of the term genocide. And what amazed me was that there were deniers. There were people who raised their hands, from time to time, as I traveled around. but they were always either Turkish or officials or individuals who had been sent out by the Turkish embassy.
This is Samantha Power, and she gave this interview before she became our ambassador to the UN.
That's a sign, in a way, that already Turkish deniers are becoming the equivalent socially, culturally, of Holocaust deniers.
So the irony is Samantha Power, who has a big chapter in her book about, it's called A Problem from Hell. And now she is in an administration under President Obama in which she cannot use the word genocide publicly at the UN.
Tabii ki kelime ki tabii ki çok orijinal olsa ne olsa şimdi çünkü hiçbir şey yapamıyor, hiçbir basmıyor.
Now we're going to go to various other sources from C-SPAN and so forth. We're going to jump forward to the political aspect. What has happened to this horrible episode in history when it comes to the world of politics? As I told you before, it became the forgotten genocide. But beginning in 1965, Armenians in America and all over the world, they began to call attention to it, protest. And one of the ways of calling attention to it was to introduce genocide resolutions in the U.S. Congress, in Europe, and so forth. And here we have a debate in 1987, someone you may recognize today.
Armenian genocide occurred, and if so, too, should we commemorate that genocide? The answer is an absolute, unequivocal yes. The Armenian genocide is very well documented, and I find it extremely distressing and mind-boggling to hear references to the genocide as alleged, claimed, charged, or disputed. The late U.S. ambassador to Turkey, Henry Morgenthau, who was in Turkey from 1913 to 1916, affirmed in his memoirs that the Ottoman government clearly understood, and I quote him, it was giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal this fact, unquote. We have access to literally thousands of pages of testimony by survivors describing the endless rapings, murder, mutilation, and enforced starvation. But instead of going into the gory details, let me relate to you just what one German eyewitness said, a missionary and a teacher. This is what he said. After reporting the various horrors, the hacking off of hands, the piles of convulsive bodies, the slitting of throats, he concludes, quote, the object of the deportation is the extermination of the whole Armenian nation, unquote. I've heard the argument from people I respect that this resolution would be a thorn in our ally Turkey, in Turkey's side. Let me add and repeat what Mr. Bonnier said so well. We don't seem to think it's going to disturb our relations with West Germany to remember the Jewish Holocaust. So in this case, the same reasoning should apply. 20 additional seconds.
I yield the gentlelady 15 additional seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 15 long seconds.
Adolf Hitler remarked, who still talks nowadays of the extermination of the Armenians? Well, we will respond to Adolf Hitler. We do. We remember. I implore my colleagues to vote in favor of this rule and in favor of the resolution.
Just as sometimes it's better to leave things unsaid, there are some bills that should be left unconsidered. This is one such instance in which the measure involved should not have been reported from the authorizing committee and should not have been reported by the Rules Committee. In fact, it appeared at one point that it might not be reported by the Rules Committee. And on a bipartisan vote, it only was reported out 7-5. There are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle that understand this is a major mistake to be bringing this bill up with all of the foreign policy ramifications that are involved at this time on the final day before we do go out for the August district work period.
Keep in mind, constantly on C-SPAN, even those who deny that it's a genocide, under them, the word genocide is repeated over and over again, hour after hour, day after day. Even when the resolution is defeated, the public sees Armenian genocide, Armenian genocide, Armenian genocide. So in the process of winning, you could also say Turkey is losing.
We should have agreed in the Rules Committee to leave it in the Rules Committee.
Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to the rule and the resolution. It's very controversial and has far-reaching foreign policy implications, as has been explained by Secretary of State Schultz in a letter which each of us has received. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to read part of that letter. It's addressed to me and to all members. I'm writing, this is from Secretary Schultz, I'm writing to you personally, and you can say what you want about the administration position or whatever administration prior to now, but this is a letter dated August 4, 1987, from Secretary of State Schultz. I'm writing to you personally to express the administration's strong opposition to H.J. Res. 132, the so-called Armenian resolution, and to urge you to vote against it. We are, and this is the letter continues, we are seriously concerned the passage of this bill would significantly damage our relations with Turkey, a NATO ally and a friend of the United States. We have major national security interests in preserving and strengthening our relations with Turkey, whose government and people are offended by this resolution.
Support the resolution to recognize April 24th as a day to remember the Armenian Genocide. The State Department would like us to vote against this resolution because Turkey is an important ally where we have many military installations. Mr. Chairman, I submit that this is not an issue of allies and military strategy. Turkey is not going to run out of NATO and into the arms of Russia or Iran or anyone else just because we pass this resolution. Litton of military bases, it's a gut instinct about what's right and wrong. America is a melting pot. And we have to react to the legitimate concerns of people in our own nation. A wrong was committed against the Armenian people. A tragedy occurred. And we in the United States Congress ought to be responsible enough to acknowledge it.
Without objection, sword.
Mr. Speaker, no one here denies that hundreds of thousands of Armenians and maybe more lost their lives.
He referred to himself in a letter, a fundraising letter, as the Congressman from Istanbul.
Often in a cruel and barbarous fashion in the second decade of the 20th century in eastern Anatolia. And there is no member of this House on either side of the aisle who is indifferent to the sorrow and the suffering of the Armenian people. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the adoption of this resolution would be a serious mistake. It would be a mistake, first of all, because it would place in jeopardy our relationship with one of our most important NATO allies. I recognize it's very difficult for members of the House to believe that a non-binding resolution like this, dozens of which we pass every year without thinking twice about them, could possibly be taken seriously by a foreign country. And yet anyone who has been to Turkey, anyone who is knowledgeable about Turkey, knows that this would have very serious consequences for our relationship with that country. A few weeks ago, the President of Turkey, following the adoption of a similar resolution by the European Parliament, said that if the Congress adopts this resolution, Turkey would have to consider leaving NATO. I do not believe, even if the resolution is adopted, that the Turks will leave NATO. But the very fact that the President of Turkey could say that they would consider leaving the alliance should suggest that the adoption of this resolution will indeed have negative consequences for our relationship with one of our most important NATO allies.
So we know the Turks are bluffing, but we should go along with the bluff.
And we cannot afford it.
For too long, we bowed to a powerful ally and powerful interest groups. And for too long, we failed to speak the truth about the tragedy of genocide.
The Senator Robert Dole.
I think it's time for the United States Senate, the Congress, the government. It's finally time for us to do what is right. Right.
Mr. President, we're not here to determine what is right and what is wrong.
Senator Robert Byrd.
That is for the courts to do.
And talks about our being a court. But
Paul Simon, Illinois.
We decide issues of right and wrong day after day after day. We sit as a court only when we impeach. But when, for example, we voted reparations for Japanese Americans, we in fact made a decision of what was right and wrong. And we do that every day in this body. We make these judgments. And I think here again, on this issue, we have to assume some historical judgments, and I think the historical evidence is just overwhelming. And that is that in this period, genocide occurred. And we adopt this resolution on that basis. And
I believe that even further discussion on this matter on the Senate floor may run the risk of offending a valued and strategic ally and inflaming passions over which we have little understanding and no control. We may be doing the Armenian people a great disservice. Who knows? We may be helping to inflame passions right on this floor where too much has already been said. And too many have branded Turkey as a criminal. Well, they say, well, they're not talking about the present Republic of Turkey. They're talking about his forebear. I wouldn't want my grandfather to be branded a horse thief. And one can understand how the present Republic of Turkey would not want its grandparents to be branded likewise. My good friend, Mr.
One time or another, 61 senators agreed to co-sponsor the resolution. On the day the Judiciary Committee reported out the resolution, there were 50 co-sponsors. Today there are 46. Why? Not to kid anybody. The history of 1915, 1923 hasn't changed since last fall. The facts certainly haven't changed since last fall. But what has changed is the launching of a massive lobbying effort against the resolution by the administration, by the government of Turkey, by American businesses who operate in Turkey, and regrettably, by some private organizations and individuals who ought to be supportive of the resolution. Turkey gets $500 million. They get a lot of benefits from us.
It's important to keep that in mind. Until recently, some years ago, Turkey used to get $500 million a year in American aid. Even while Turkey is getting $500 million of American taxpayers' money, many congressmen and presidents are willing to go along with Turkey's denial, even though Turkey needed America more than America needed Turkey. It's a mutual arrangement.
It's not just that Turkey's helping us. Now, Turkey has a very active ambassador. He's a very fine man. I've met with him, talked to him. No quarrel about him doing his job. He's been to see every senator. But Armenia has no ambassador. They have no embassy.
And that was 1990. After 91, Armenia did have an embassy.
They don't have any contracts with any businesses in the United States. They can't put pressure on senators. Doesn't happen to be a very attractive site for an American investment in Armenia, at least right now. But lots of big American companies operate in Turkey. They put in billions in investment, and they take out millions in profits. And some of those investment dollars end up in the coffers of the Turkish government, which spends them on high-priced lobbyists who've been all over us the past few months. And some of those profits are paying for the American industry representatives who have been hammering home to many of us how important their profit margin is in Turkey.
This is rare that a senator talks so openly, directly about the power of corporations in Congress.
Goliath, all the troops, all the guns, money, and an embassy, American business, lobbyists, the whole 9 yards. They can all speak for Turkey and make the case for Turkey. Armenia, none of the above, nothing. A country flat on its back.
Why do you believe that Turkey refuses to recognize those events between 1915 and 1918 as a genocide?
Well, it's natural, first of all. It's human nature, I suppose. When one is guilty of a crime, it's human nature to try to deny it. A murderer denies, a thief denies, so there's part of his human nature. No one likes to have that as part of his history, especially a genocide. You'd have to ask that to the Turkish government. I think they're making a mistake. I think if they were to recognize it, if they had recognized it a long time ago, it wouldn't keep coming up. It wouldn't be a burden, an albatross around their necks. So the Turkish government has to, I think, answer that question.
Other reasons for Turkey to deny is because that there might be a question of reparations. If genocide is admitted, it opens a door to compensation, all kinds of reparations, and the amount of money that Turkey, it's hard to get, that Turkey owes Armenia is enormous. That's one reason. Another reason is that the founders of the current Republic of Turkey, who I said before the movement was led by Mustafa Kemal, many of them who formed the government, the first government of the Republic of Turkey, were men with blood on their hands. And that if Turkey acknowledges it, then inside Turkey, society would have to face the fact that their heroes, their George Washingtons, Thomas Jeffersons, Alexander Hamiltons, Benjamin Franklins, were mass murderers.
Now, in your mind, that the murder of 1.5 million Armenians between 1915 and 1923 constituted genocide. Is there any doubt about that?
Congressman, I think that these historical
circumstances
require
Secretary of State.
A very detailed and sober look from historians. And what we've encouraged the Turks and the Armenians to do is to have joint historical commissions that can look at this, to have efforts to examine their past, and in examining their past, to get over their past. But I will tell you, Congressman, I don't think that it helps that process of reconciliation for the United States to enter this debate at that level.
She's so wrong. It's that intervention from outside that puts pressure on the Turkish government to try to find a reconciliation. If there's no, there's a lot of good things happening inside Turkey, but without that, it's the resolutions, it's the activity from outside that makes the Turkish government uncomfortable to the point of trying to find some kind of solution. So she is so wrong.
Madam Secretary, your comments, you think that there should be some kind of debate or discussion about the genocide, suggests that you have a question about whether genocide occurred. Is that correct?
Congressman, I believe that this is something that Turks and Armenians are best to address through their own processes of coming to terms with their history. Lots of people have had to come to terms with their history.
Yes, and Madam Secretary, we have to come to grips with our own history, yes, and we do.
I personally welcome that.
Madam Secretary, you come out of academia.
Yes.
Is there any historic debate outside of Turkey? Is there any reputable historian you're aware of that takes issue with the fact that the murder of 1.5 million Armenians constituted genocide?
Congressman, I come out of academia, but I'm Secretary of State now. And I think that the best way to have this proceed is for the United States not to be in the position of making this judgment, but rather for the Turks and the Armenians to come to their own terms about this. Lots of people are coming to terms with their history. In Asia, in Europe, people have had to come to terms with their history. And as you said,
we have no reluctance. We have no reluctance to recognize genocide in Darfur. We have no reluctance to talk about the Cambodian genocide or the Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust. Why is it only this genocide? Is it because Turkey is a strong ally? Is that an ethical or moral reason to ignore the murder of 1.5 million people? Why is it we don't say let's ignore to relegate the Cambodian genocide, Rwandan genocide? Why is it only this genocide that we should let the Turks acknowledge and not acknowledge? And Madam Secretary, Hrant Dink, who was murdered outside of his office, is not a testimony to Turkish progress. The fact that Turkey brought a Nobel-winning author up on charges of insulting Turkishness because he talked about the murder of the Armenians doesn't show great efforts of reconciliation in Turkey. Why is it only this genocide we're incapable of recognizing.
Congressman, we have recognized, and the President recognizes every year in a resolution that he himself issues, the historical circumstances and the tragedy that befell the Armenian people at that time. We do recognize it. But I don't, if you'll just allow me, I do not see that this situation is going to get better in the sense that it allows Turks and Armenians to move on to deal with their present, unless we are able to let them deal with their past. As to the murder,
Madam Secretary, because I'm going to run out of time, you recognize more than anyone as a diplomat the power of words.
Yes.
And I'm sure you supported the recognition of genocide in Darfur, not calling it tragedy, not calling it atrocity, not calling it anything else, but the power and significance of calling it genocide. Why is that less important in the case of the Armenian genocide?
Congressman, the power here is in helping these people to move forward.
This has always been...
It's hard for Armenia to move forward without justice for the genocide, because it's the genocide that has put Armenia and the Armenian people in this unenviable position.
Viewed, and I think properly so, as a matter of historical debate and conclusions rather than political. And I think that this is the right posture for the U.S. government to be in, because whatever the terrible event might be, or the high emotions that it represents, to try to use government power to resolve historical issues, I think, opens a door that is very dangerous to go through. And this is, tragically, very much the line of the Turkish government. And many in the Armenian community are wondering how we could go from such a powerful position in the state Senate, such a powerful position that we took decades ago before the International Court of Justice, the powerful voice that President Reagan brought to this issue, to where we were last month. And I want to ask you, is there any question that you have that the facts of that tragic period between 1915 and 1923 constitute genocide? And do you have any different view on the subject now than you did as a U.S. Senator?
Well, Congressman, you quoted something that I said in response to a question about France trying to criminalize speech about this terrible event in history. And I do think criminalizing speech is a dangerous path to go down. And in fact, as I understand it, the French courts just declared that law unconstitutional under the French Constitution. So let me be very clear. The United States recognizes the events of 1915 as one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. And every April 24th, the President honors the victims and expresses American solidarity with the Armenian people. And the President has said in his Remembrance Day statements that the achievement of a full, frank, and just acknowledgement of the facts of what happened is in everyone's interest. He's also said that the best way to advance that goal is for the Armenian and Turkish people to address the facts of the past as a part of their effort to move forward. And President Obama, like presidents before him, strongly supports the efforts of Turkey and Armenia to normalize their bilateral relations. So we believe that this is a position that fully reflects the terrible events of 1915, but also is aimed at trying to create a climate in which these two peoples and nations can move forward together.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to run out of time. And no one is correlating with a position against criminalizing speech in this country. No one is advocating that.
But that's what the answer you quoted from was responding to in terms of the question, Congressman. So I just want to make the record straight.
Madam Secretary, I want to keep the record straight too. Your answer went well beyond whether it should be criminalized. Your answer said this is a matter of historical debate. And that is what is causing so much anguish in the community. And it's not just anguish. There is a very concrete injury, which we saw last week. Decision.
I'm going to go forward a bit to save some time. Hillary Clinton continued to refuse to use the word. This is in Turkey.
Of the Armenian Genocide. And you also supported the passage of the Armenian Genocide Resolution. You said as president you would recognize the genocide. And my question for you is, have you changed your view? And did you ask President Gül to recognize the genocide by name?
The Turkish president is standing next to, President Gül is standing next to Obama.
I have changed views, but I have been very encouraged.
And he just said, I have not changed my view. He has said repeatedly before in writing and elsewhere that it is a genocide. Now, standing next to the Turkish president, he said, I have not changed my views.
I want to be as encouraging as possible around those negotiations which are moving forward and could bear fruit very quickly, very soon. And so as a consequence, what I want to do is not focus on my views right now, but focus on the views of the Turkish and the Armenian people. If they can move forward and deal with a difficult and tragic history, then I think the entire world should encourage them. And so what I told the president was I want to be as constructive as possible in moving these issues forward quickly. And my sense is that they are moving quickly. I don't want to, as the President of the United States, preempt any possible arrangements or announcements that might be made in the near future. I just want to say that we are going to be a partner in working through these issues in such a way that the most important parties, the Turks and the Armenians, are finally coming to terms in a constructive way.
So if I understand you correctly, your view hasn't changed, but you'll put in abeyance the issue of whether to use that word in the future?
What I'd like to do is to encourage...
He repeated the same answer, that he will not use the word, but his views haven't changed. So he promised, like other presidents, before he got elected, forcefully that it's a genocide. After becoming president, until today, President Obama has not used the word. Let's see what he does this year. This is the final excerpt, bear with me, from Armenia the Betrayed, from BBC. We might go just a couple of minutes over, so bear with me.
Genocide recognition. Vote at subcommittee level approaching, those pushing genocide recognition were increasingly optimistic.
I think the longer that the members of Congress heard the Turkish MPs talk about the fact that in their opinion there was no genocide or this did not exist, it never happened, the more the votes swung toward those of us that were wanting the recognition. And so in what they had hoped to be a very close vote ended up being a larger, quite a swing in favor of the genocide recognition bill that we were seeking as a result of the Turkish testimony, because they really are in denial.
The subcommittee voted in favor of the resolution, paving the way for a vote before the full Congress.
I was very upset, of course. I thought it was really pathetic.
The Turkish member of parliament,
who clearly didn't even have a passport and had never traveled anywhere in their lives, were voting on something that they knew nothing about.
On the morning of the vote, the congressmen sponsoring the bill did their final tallies.
It was optimistic, the atmosphere, because we had
two-thirds majority in the House to pass this.
Deportation of Armenians was enough to recognize genocide by the legislators of the most powerful nation on earth. And then, just before the vote was left on the clock, something extraordinary happened.
The vote was coming up in the evening, and we were heading over with our staff to begin the debate, which would lead to this vote. And as we were walking up the steps of the Capitol, one of my staff members got a phone call from the Speaker's office.
That morning, the White House caved in to Turkish pressure. President Clinton called the House Speaker and asked him to withdraw the bill. Clinton's message to the Speaker was extraordinary. He cited grave national security concerns. He believed passing the resolution could endanger American lives.
It looks like Turkey made threats against American soldiers and Americans in Turkey.
In the House chamber, they were already into other business.
And your genocide resolution was gone.
Never
happened. So what exactly scared the leader of the free world? The answer lies in the dangerous politics of the Middle East. Here, the Turks are allies who provide air bases vital for patrolling the skies over Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
So what was it, do you think, was said by the Turkish government?
Listen very carefully to what she says.
Well, I don't really want to say that it was really what we have said. Of course we have said the same things.
National security, I think they also talked about American lives potentially being at risk.
That detail I do not remember, but certainly grave consequences or implications and security rights were there. But you know,
so what do you think? What do you think it meant? Grave national security concerns.
To me, if you really want my personal point of view, I think it was President Clinton's very good foresight and appreciation and evaluation of Turkey's position in the region and the value that they attach to our friendship and collaboration as a NATO ally.
But with a new president, the Armenians would have another chance. George W. Bush had made a campaign.
Same promise.
The Armenians were subjected to a genocidal campaign, he said. If elected president, I would ensure that our nation properly recognizes the tragic suffering of the Armenian people. That was before he came to power and before his campaign against Saddam Hussein. George Bush badly needs the help of the new Turkish government. America wants to launch a land invasion of Iraq from Turkey,
which Turkey denied.
Strategic ally and friend of the United States. And we look forward to working with you to keep the peace.
Unfortunately, many American policymakers don't realize that Turkey's value could still be of value to the U.S. without caving in an immoral way for something that is documented in American archives, which is part of American history. There's so much more to say, but we're out of time. Thank you very much for your attention.